Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSE Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
I was able to get my hands on these spy records that were from these sealed files.
That's investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell. In the 1990s, he started working on a handful of closed civil rights era cases, which he had reason to believe were never brought to justice.
What I learned and what outraged me was the fact that despite more than 20 klansmen being involved in killing those three young men, nobody had ever been prosecuted for murder.
Today, stories of reopened racially charged murder cases in the American South.
I've had dozens of death threats. Them trying to threaten me really made me more determined to do it than ever. A life of fear is not worth living.
All coming right up. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. Today's interview with Jerry Mitchell is especially meaningful to me. Jerry is an investigative journalist in Mississippi whom I had met in years past when I would take graduate students on a week-long study tour of significant civil rights era historic sites. I had always found his stories troubling, inspiring, shocking, moving. So when we started our podcast long before No Small Endeavor was a radio show, I heard Jerry was coming to Nashville and asked him if he'd be game to sit down for an interview. I have a fond memory of picking up Jerry and bringing him to our house on a rainy spring day, and we sat in our living room and taped this interview with our little dog Otis snuggled up next to Jerry as he shared his stories. Jerry's stories are a moving response to our tagline, exploring what it means to live a good life. For Jerry, that exploration has required a sustained pursuit of both justice and courage. He exemplifies a pursuit of justice in a system that has been historically riddled with injustice, and he exemplifies the courage necessary to persevere in that work. Here's the interview, originally recorded in May of 2020. Delighted today to have Jerry Mitchell, who's an investigative journalist, formerly with the Jackson, Mississippi Clarion-Ledger. His book, being received with rave reviews and widespread acclaim, is entitled Race Against Time, A Reporter Reopens the Unsolved Murder Cases of the Civil Rights Era. Welcome, Jerry.
Well, it's good to be with you, Lee.
It's good to be with you. The last time I think I was with you was in Jackson, Mississippi itself.
That's right.
Bringing a group of students through on one of the civil rights tours.
I always love talking to the students. It's always good.
It's a wonderful sort of venture to get to do such things. So we're very grateful to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So if I understand correctly, as I've heard you tell the stories through the years, that the work that you've done in investigative journalism has ended up leading to something like 24 convictions in civil rights murder cases.
Yeah, there have been 24 overall nationwide.
How in the world did you begin getting into such work?
I saw a movie, and it's called Mississippi Burning.
Yeah, I remember that movie.
It's about the Ku Klux Klan's killings of 3 civil rights workers, young people, young men by the name of James Chaney, Andy Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner. They were all involved in the civil rights movement. Andy Goodman was coming down as a part of those students, 1,000 students that trained in Ohio and were kind of coming down to Mississippi. And when they got back, or even before they got back, the reason they came back early was because the Klan had bombed one of the churches, like set it on fire, where the Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney had spoken before. And so the Klan burned that church to the ground. And so the civil rights workers came to investigate that particular fire, and members of the church were beaten as well.
And in that particular case, those 3 young men ended up being killed.
They were killed by the Klan. They were arrested, put in jail, and then released. The deputy sheriff, who was a Klansman himself, released those 3 young men into the hands of waiting Klansmen, who then in turn killed them and buried their bodies 15 feet down in an earthen dam.
Goodness. So you saw this movie, Mississippi Burning.
Yep.
And how did that end up getting you into this work?
Well, what happened was I saw it with a couple of FBI agents who investigated that case, as well as a journalist who covered that case. And basically what I learned and what outraged me was the fact that no one had ever been, despite more than 20 Klansmen being involved in killing those 3 young men, nobody had ever been prosecuted for murder. And that was what I couldn't wrap my head around, that nobody had ever been prosecuted for murder. And so that kind of began both my education and my journey. I knew nothing of any of this. This was not something I learned in school. I knew very little about the civil rights movement, period. And I certainly didn't know much about the violence connected to the movement, other than I remember when I was a young kid that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I do remember that. That kind of came through into my little child's world, but the rest of it all escaped me.
I remember, I grew up in Talladega, Alabama, and one of the bombings of the buses occurred probably, I don't know, maybe 15-minute drive from my home.
Right.
And that would have been before I was born, but I never remember having heard it talked about when I was a kid.
Exactly. No one talked about it.
And it was 15 minutes away from my house. And it was not until I was in seminary, actually in Texas,
right,
that I began watching a video series that one of our professors had us watch. And that was the first I'd ever heard about this story.
I mean, there was a whole series of black churches in my hometown of Texarkana, Texas, that got bombed. And I never knew that until they invite some alum back for this gathering in the early 2000s. And suddenly I hear someone talking about, oh yeah, my church got bombed. I was like, what? And so I didn't know, even my own hometown, I didn't know about, some of some of the horrible things that happened. To the town's credit, they were able to kind of come together and rally and begin to rebuild those churches. And they went through a tough time too, but I didn't know any of that growing up.
So here you are, the late 80s, you see this movie, you kind of feel this sense of indignation about
outrage, anger.
Yeah. So then what happens from that point forward?
Not too long after that, about a month later, an unrelated yet related event happened, which was I was able to get my hands on these spy records, just a smattering of them, just a little bit of one, that were from these sealed files. There were these spy records that were part of the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was the state segregationist spy agency. It was operating in Mississippi, headed by the governor. And
was it an official government bureaucracy?
It was an official state agency headed by the governor, and then all the top state leaders were a part of it. It's kind of the state equivalent of a white citizens council. And they had a propaganda arm in which they promoted segregation by sending people up north and bragging about segregation. And then they also had a spy arm where they infiltrated civil rights groups and different things like that. So it's very fascinating. And so I was interested in getting those spy files, and eventually developed sources began to leak them to me. And what I found out was at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. LeBeckwith, this other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting the defense, trying to get Beckwith acquitted, and nobody knew that.
So let's back up just a second. For those who don't remember Byron Dale Beckwith,
tell us explain who it is. Well, Medgar Evers, let me tell that first. Medgar Evers was the field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP. He's kind of the head of the NAACP in Mississippi. Basically been fighting for years for African Americans to be full citizens, and was assassinated, shot in the back in his own driveway, June 12th, 1963. And he was shot by and killed by a man named Byron D. LeBeckwith, who is a member of the White Citizens Council and a Klansman as well.
Byron D. LeBeckwith was in fact arrested and even tried twice in 1964.
But hung juries both times, and he walked free.
For people who that just can't possibly make sense how that would happen when there's all sorts of evidence that he did it, how does something like that happen?
Well, a couple of things that happened. One is he had an all-white, all-male jury. And the reason he had an all-white jury is because African Americans weren't allowed to vote. Those jury rolls are pulled from voting rolls, essentially. That's where those come from. And then on top of that, Mississippi wouldn't allow women to be on juries until 1968.
Huh.
So it was literally an all-white, all-male jury. On top of that, there were some police officers who basically lied. I think we can say this now, in confidence, as they lied and basically claimed they saw Beckwith in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is where he lived, at least an hour and a half away. I mean, and back in those days, it was probably closer to 2 hours. They claimed they'd seen him like pumping gas at 1:05 a.m., but they didn't connect the time to anything. There's a lot of problems in my mind with that testimony.
So with all of these things, he hung jury twice in 1964.
Right.
And then he goes off and lives
He just
his
walks
life.
free. He goes home. In fact, they had a banner across one of the bridges and Delta bridges that said, "Welcome home, Delay." That is kind of his nickname, Delay.
Wow.
Welcome home is a hero.
So when do you and Byron de la Beckwith meet up?
April of 1990. So I wrote my story on what I just mentioned, ran October 1st of 1989, and then went to go visit Mr. Beckwith. That was in April of 1990.
And what was that like? Or first, before you say what it was like, how did you possibly, I assume you don't just go knock on the door.
No, I called him. I mean, he and I have been talking on the phone for a little bit. It took me a while to get his phone number. He had an unlisted phone number, but I actually had help from a incredibly well-known, at least in reporting circles, reporter by the name of Johnny Popham. He worked for the New York Times for a long time, and then before coming back to the Chattanooga paper. And so he was retired, but I guess they hung out or they knew him or whatever, and he was the one that actually helped me get Byron de la Beckwith's home number. And so I called Beckwith, and we kind of started a series of conversations, and I had to pass the quiz in order to go interview him.
What sort of quiz?
Well, what are your parents' names? Where do you live? Where do you go to church? Where'd you go to college? I mean, I guess I could. Of course, I went to Harding University. I could have refused to answer, but I knew he'd like my answers. You know what I mean? And so I just kind of told the truth, and I have
that your answers kind of gave you credibility as a white man, as a white Southern Christian man.
I'm a WASP, and so that I checked off all the boxes,
Yeah.
So he kind of said, "Come on," and so I went to visit him.
What'd you find when you get there?
Oh, it was absolutely the most racist person I ever spent any serious time with. It just N-word this, N-word that, and very anti-Semitic. I mean, just anybody who wasn't white, he pretty much hated.
When you went to see him, what were you hoping to accomplish? Just as from the perspective of a journalist perspective,
Yeah.
what were kind of your agenda? What would be your
really
best case
agenda.
scenario there you had?
Well, I think some reporters would have come in with a kind of a gotcha interview, but my mentality was more, how this guy, because I already talked to him on the phone, how did this guy get to be such a racist? And that's what I was kind of curious about. How did he get to be such a racist? And I think I got at least some semblance of an answer. So it was interesting because he just joined everything, including eventually the Klan. Now, he didn't admit he joined the Klan, but it was pretty obvious he did. He was praising the Klan in our conversation.
So you have this conversation with him. You begin to get a picture of kind of what he's up to.
Oh, yeah. Talked about the White Citizens Council like it was a long-lost love. You know what I mean? He was just very praising of it.
Yeah. Then you leave?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things about detail is kind of interesting. I'll throw in that at some point his wife brought him this. It looked like orange soda, but then she brought it in, for him to drink. And as I kind of looked more closely at the drink, it was like bubbling furiously, like some kind of mad scientist potion. I'm like, what in the world is this? And so I asked him, of course, at some point, I was like, what is that you're drinking? And it was indeed orange soda, but it was combined with food grade hydrogen peroxide. And I was like, really?
What's that about?
Well, he was a believer in something called chelation, which is CHELATO. And The radical right kind of seized on it. But the belief was that you would ingest something and then it would grab all these poisons and pull them out of your body.
Huh. De La Beckwith held to a bizarre ideology known as Christian identity, a sect in extreme right-wing circles with twisted views about human origins and race. And just a warning, this is difficult to hear.
I'll do this real quickly. It's blunt and it's very racist. So just, I apologize in advance for how offensive this is. But he believed that Adam and Eve were white people. He believed that non-white people were created on the sixth day, and they call them mud people, by the way, and have no souls. They're like animals. They have no soul. And then he believes that Jews are satanic. Like he believes that Eve had sex with Satan the serpent, and that's where Jews came from. I mean, that's really awful and racist and anti-Semitic. But yeah, that is what he believed.
You began to have all this kind of conversation with him. You told this great story about kind of what happens on the way back out to the car.
Yeah, it was getting dark. He lived in Single Mountain, Tennessee, which is outside of Chattanooga. And he insisted on walking me to the car. And I'm like, really, that's okay. I think I can find my way. And so he walks me out to the car anyway. He gets me out to the car and says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with a sandwich.
After Jerry's investigation, De La Beckwith's case was reopened in the 90s.
He went on trial and finally in 1994 and was convicted on February 5th, 1994. In Jackson, in the exact same courtroom he'd been tried in almost 30 years to the day. And when the word guilty rang out, you could hear the waves of joy as they cascaded down the hall until it reached a foyer full of people, black and white, just erupted in cheers. And I just felt chills because the impossible had suddenly become possible.
And Medgraver's wife was there, I think.
And she was there, and her daughter Rena and her son Daryl, and they all cheered.
Yeah.
I just felt chills because, the impossible had suddenly become possible.
Yeah. You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Jerry Mitchell, originally recorded in May of 2020. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We'd be delighted if you'd tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast, because it helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Jerry and I discuss some more reopened cases he helped bring to justice, the dangers of doing such work, plus his thoughts on the role of journalism in a polarized world. You tell at least 4 major cases in your book.
I do, right? I do.
I think you also tell a story about Vernon Dahmer.
Yeah, Vernon Dahmer.
Yeah, can you kind of give us a sketch of his story?
Yeah. Vernon Dahmer is a very fascinating guy. What an incredible family. I just love the Vernon Dahmer family. But he was a farmer, businessman, entrepreneur, but he was dedicated really to getting the right to vote to all Americans. And the Klan didn't like that and attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, January 10th, 1966, set the house on fire, began firing their guns into the house. Vernon Dahmer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran in the front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs and he died later that day. A few weeks later in the mail came his voter registration card. He had fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but never been able to cast a ballot himself. And the guy who ordered the killing, Sam Bowers, was the head of the White Knights of the KKK, had never been convicted in that case.
Before we talk about Sam Bowers, for those who aren't aware with the way the mechanism of inhibiting black voter
Yeah,
registration worked. I mean, my understanding is that one of the guys who was over voter registration there,
the circuit clerk.
yeah, that he would ask the question, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap?
Yeah,
and if you
yeah.
couldn't answer that question, you couldn't register.
The history of that is, and I mentioned this briefly in my book, is basically after Reconstruction, when the Union troops left in 1875, 1876 from the South, Mississippi, white Mississippians essentially began to reassert power, both by violence, hook or crook, whatever, and eventually began to take power again, or to, in their words, reassert white supremacy. So in 1890, they adopted a new constitution that basically put in place poll taxes and constitutional quiz. And so these circuit clerks acted as gatekeepers. And then 2 years later, they adopted basically a state law that kicked everybody off the voting rolls, black and white. So they had to reapply.
Okay.
So once they had to reapply, the circuit clerks, basically everybody who was the whites who came in, they just passed with flying colors, and they were a lot of times say, "Oh yeah, Joe, I know you. You go ahead and register." And African American came in, it would be like, "Oh no, oh no, you don't understand what that part of the Constitution means," or they might ask some absurd question like, which I know got asked in Mississippi, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? I mean, they basically would either ask impossible questions that they couldn't answer or things like that, and therefore barred African Americans from voting for many years.
I think that's one of the things that so often seems to me people overlook is that there's a huge difference between a law that's on the books and social policy that may inhibit the intent of the law on the books.
Bingo. It was the law. It was the law in Mississippi, and many other southern states adopted that, including, I think, Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken, essentially had something similar to that. It was adopted throughout the South. The combination of both poll taxes and some kind of test or quiz. I think some other states also had what they would call a grandfather clause. You couldn't vote unless your grandfather voted, and different things like that. So there was a whole series of laws like that.
So when people come in, like in the summer, Freedom Summer, they're coming in trying to help people get registered to vote.
Right.
Vernon Damer's trying to help people get registered to vote.
In his own community. And he actually had, in 1961, actually had some civil rights activists actually living with him, and they were actually working on voter registration and going around and getting African Americans registered to vote.
So Vernon Damer dies after this horrific firebombing. What happens in his case?
So basically the case got reopened after the Vernon Damer family met with me. I did a story that met with the district attorney. He reopened the case. He acted interested at the time, and then got kind of cold feet over time. And then another district attorney came in. And it was like starting over. It just looked like nothing was going to happen. And so I ended up going to grad school at Ohio State. And while I was in Ohio State, I get this telephone call from this guy that claimed he had information on the Vernon Damer case and wanted to meet with me. And so I flew back to Mississippi and met with him. And he turned out he had worked for Sam Bowers and helped type up Klan propaganda and stuff like that. So it was interesting. And so I came back and met him, and he had overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Damer. After that was in spring of 1997, then he met with the authorities, and the authorities reopened the case. Yeah. So Bowers got arrested in May of 1998. He was arrested with his right-hand guy. This guy's name is Devers Nix. And when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. They were like wheeling him in the wheelchair with the green oxygen tank that he's breathing out of. And they wheel him up in front of the judge, and he's like, "I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge." And so the judge is like, "Well, I normally don't do this, but I'm lay out without bond." So a dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. We catch him on the golf course. We got pictures, and he got arrested. So we had like before and after pictures in the paper, Klansman says he's too sick for jail, but not for golf.
Wow.
So he got arrested. Yeah. He loved me.
Yeah. That is something else.
Yeah.
But Sam Bowers ends up being convicted.
He ends up being convicted August 21st of 1998 and sentenced to life in prison, just like Beckles.
Yeah. You've indicated that you've experienced your own sort of, well, as the story you told us about Byron De La Beckwith a moment ago, but you've experienced plenty of kind of death threats and
Oh, yeah,
as you've
yeah,
gone.
yeah. I've had dozens of death threats. A klansman repeatedly kept telling me he was going to slit my throat, and God said he had pictures of me and knew where I lived, and just all sorts of things like that, just over the years. Plus, I even got confronted in a church parking lot. What are you doing digging up the past? You know what I mean? That kind of thing, That was more harassment than threat.
Yeah.
But it was just like, why are you doing this? And I was like, this is news. This is important.
Yeah. So how does one go about, obviously these are people who are threatening you who have a history of violence.
Oh, yeah.
So
There's no question about that.
These are not incredible threats, the credibility to them. How does one go about processing that sort of threat?
Well, for me personally, I think the thing that's helped me the most has been faith. And that is because if somebody kills me, I just get to go home sooner. And I think for me personally, that's helped me a lot. Another thing is I was pretty young at the time, young and obsessed and not willing to be intimidated. I don't know what else to say. And I just was headstrong and all those things, and not really, them trying to threaten me really made me more determined to do it than ever.
Yeah. So what would you say to people with regard to, when I look at a story like that, I'm always telling my students, I teach ethics classes, so I tell my students that I can teach the most brilliant ethics class and you can understand all this stuff, but if you don't have courage, then in many ways it's not going to mean anything.
No, it's not going to mean a thing.
Because that's when the push comes to shove. You got to be able to somehow act on what you think is right.
Right. And it's all about living fearlessly. And that's kind of the unexpected gift I got from that. And living fearlessly is not about living without fear. Living fearlessly is about living beyond fear. It's about living for something greater than ourselves. And I think if we understand that and are willing to live for that, the people in the movement, civil rights movement, that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were living for something greater than ourselves, because it's when we're able to do that, I think that we can kind of take that next step and be courageous, because that's what we want. We want to live courageously. We want to live courageous lives, because I don't know, a life of fear is not worth living.
Yeah. Yeah. It is remarkable that you have gotten to play your part in a movement that just has so many heroes of such immense courage. That's
over and over again.
Yeah.
I mean, we could sit here all day and talk about the courage of just ordinary people, as we might say. The extraordinary courage of ordinary people.
Yeah.
Over and over again. Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses. Wow, just many, many. Ramsey Moore. I mean, that aren't necessarily known to the average American. I think it's one of the problems too, is we don't teach our history. And the other part of the equation is that we sometimes leave out is, for lack of a better term, the white defiance they were going up against. It wasn't just the Klan. It was the entire state, powers that be, everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to come back to that in just a moment. Before we go to that, let me ask this question about kind of internal dynamics here.
Sure.
As I've been thinking about this, I'm reminded of a quote that I often like to use in class as well, from Aristotle, where he once said something like, the virtuous human being will be angry in the right way, with the right intensity, for the right length of time, in response to the right thing. And when I first read that, I thought, oh, well, thanks very much. That's very helpful. But the more I've reflected upon that, I think it's pretty brilliant. So when you talked about seeing Mississippi burning and that beginning this sort of...
I was angry.
Very angry. What does it look like over a long haul to let anger be properly ordered and become, I guess, fuel for just action versus it becoming seeds of bitterness that just eat you away inside?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The answer, at least we get from Solomon, is don't let the sun go down on your anger. I mean, I think this, if we're angry, well, make it more personal. If we're angry at somebody, the idea is to go take care of that. You don't let that fester, because when it festers, that's when it kind of becomes bitterness. But I think these kind of cases, in my opinion, What this is more like, to borrow a term, righteous anger, or whatever you want to call it, just anger. And I think it's okay to be angry in that way and to seek justice. I think that's what, from a faith perspective, God loves justice. That's what, Isaiah says, and God is just. So it's not like, I think that when I did a deep dive on scriptures and stuff after Byron D. LeBecq was convicted, I really began to really think more about what justice was and what it means and what it looks like.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It does seem to me bizarre in the ways in which we have such social and political polarization. And among some, there's this sort of language as if that if you start talking about justice, that's somehow suspect as some sort of leftist progressive agenda.
No, that's not what the Bible says.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, one Old Testament scholar, talks about how social justice is a conservative issue because it's there over and over and over again.
You don't have to read the Bible very much to come away with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's what does God expect of us? To walk humbly, to do justice, and to love mercy.
Yeah.
I mean, and justice is more than just what happens in a courtroom.
Right.
We shouldn't, with that, to describe that, we shouldn't have a different set of scales of justice for those who are powerful, who are rich, for whatever, which unfortunately happens too many times in this country. Just as a reporter who's covered it for years, I know it's true. But then the other part of that is justice is just about how we treat each other. How do we treat the least of these? I'm going to give a simple example. I know in Mississippi, now they did finally change it, but it's still not that much better. The Mississippi legislature allowed the law to be changed. They used to have laws against this called usury laws. Mm-hmm. And instead, Mississippi legislature, like a lot of other state legislatures, were willing to change the law, and even in some cases the Constitution, to allow these payday lendings places or title loan places or whatever to charge the equivalent of, like, this was the one in Mississippi, 573% interest.
Oh, my goodness.
For like a loan. Now, I just think that's just so far beyond the pale.
Yeah.
But for a state legislature to change the law and allow essentially poor people to be, in my opinion, to be exploited to that extent, because you are essentially exploiting them in that level. And we as a society didn't used to allow that, but we've now opened the door to allow that. And I mean, what are you doing? We as a society should try to protect, and I'm not trying to go on a wild crusade, but let's say the lottery. And we say, oh yeah, the lottery is a great thing. Well, who does the lottery? Well, a lot of the people that do, you don't see rich people going in to buy a bunch of lottery tickets most of the time.
Yeah. My understanding is that studies on that basically show it's like a regressive tax on the poor.
Exactly, on the poor. So, and we can debate these things socially and everything, but it's something we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah.
And that's justice too, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of the biblical scholarship around justice will talk about how clearly you have in Scripture this sort of element in which justice is the sort of retributive justice that you get in the criminal justice system. But as you say, one of the first things about that is that it must be equitably dealt out,
exactly.
Right? And then there's this other piece of justice where, and you could say even the more emphatic element of justice in the Hebrew prophets is on the sort of holistic concern for the community, especially concern for the poor, the marginalized, the foreigner,
the oppressed,
the widow, the orphan, and
exactly.
so forth. We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, Jerry discusses the dangers posed by the rise of white supremacy and faith-based nationalism and gives his thoughts on how truth-seeking journalism has a crucial place in a polarized world. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSE Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSE Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. You have moved from, you were the Clarion Ledger there in Jackson for what, 30 years or so?
Yeah, 3 decades or so.
But now you've moved over to a new nonprofit.
I started a
work?
nonprofit. I'm essentially continue to do what I've always done, which is investigative reporting.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in criminal justice system, and we're looking at those things. For instance, one of the areas we're exploring right now is juveniles who've been sentenced to life without parole. And so that's something the U.S. Supreme Court has come back and said, hey, wait a minute, this ought to be rare, not frequent. And for whatever reason in Mississippi so far, most of the judges have either given the same sentence or not resentenced. So we're taking a look at that. Over the past year, I've written about prisons in Mississippi. And it's really fascinating. It's just fascinating that the least of these, so to speak, are just, it's almost like, hey, just go away. We don't want to know what's going on, almost kind of situation. And I'm always fascinated by being able to report on places and things and people that aren't being reported on, these hidden worlds. So we just kind of took a deep dive into prisons along with the help of ProPublica. We got a grant from them for a year. And basically, bottom line, we kind of showed the prisons were going to blow up in Mississippi, and they did in December, and all these people, were killed in basically a gang war.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, and we had basically showed how the gangs were running the place because I have enough staff, 50% vacancy rate.
50% vacancy rate in the staff of the prison?
Exactly, in staffing. The correctional officers only being paid $25,000
oh my goodness.
a year, which qualified them and their families for food stamps in Mississippi. So it's just all sorts of awful situations. And so we reported on that, and that's part of what we do. We want to warn the public and public officials, and they did nothing, and that's what happened.
What do you do with the argument of somebody like Michelle Alexander in the new Jim Crow, where she's making the argument that the mechanisms of Jim Crow systematically have been relocated to the kind of criminal justice system mechanisms?
The mass incarceration and that kind of thing, which is an interesting argument. I mean, certainly you can, if you look at Mississippi, you went from slave plantations to a plantation at Parchman Prison. It was a plantation, and essentially you had inmates that worked on what they called the sun up to sundown gang. They actually raised, on average, in the early years of Parchman, and then that, of course, it increased over time. They actually brought in, I think it was the modern equivalent of about $5 million.
Wow.
Over 2 years to the state treasury. So it was like a big boon to the state treasury for many years. And of course, they would not only do that for the plantation that Parchman had, the prison had, but they would kind of farm them out into other people's plantations, and they would be paid for that as well. So it became a huge money-making racket. And of course, the people who were working were getting zip. They were getting nothing.
Yeah.
And they were essentially, there's a whole book on it by David Ashinsky. It's called Worse Than Slavery. So essentially you kind of see the beginnings of that in the Parchman prison system.
So in your work now, what sorts of echoes, are there echoes of 1960s you're hearing now 40 years later? Or what are the sort of things that you're seeing and hearing that cause yellow flags, red flags in your psyche?
Well, there's been a real rise in white nationalism, white supremacy. There's no question of that. I mean, you see this whole series, not just even in the United States, but around the world, of terrorist attacks or white supremacist attacks or anti-Semitic attacks on Hispanics, others, churches, synagogues, mosque, you name it. And it's all, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it sometimes is unfortunately in the name of God, quote unquote, you know?
Yeah.
And, but the white supremacy is, you're seeing a real increase in nationalism and nativism. And there's been a real increase in what I would call identity politics and things. And we're essentially, the disconcerting thing, especially in this country, is I sense we are fracturing as a nation along racial identity, other partisan political lines.
From your take on this, what are some of the major elements that have been contributing to this fracturing?
That's a great question. I don't know if I know all the reasons why, other than an embracing of nativism, identityism, whatever you want to call it, of people that are embracing that white nationalism and different things like that are the equivalents across the board.
In what ways do you feel that the media itself is contributing to our polarization?
That's a great question. Well, one of the ways, I guess you could say, or what's happening is kind of we've devolved back to over 100 years ago, which is when we used to have, like back with newspapers were basically the media. Back then, you would have like the Republican whatever newspaper, or you'd have, they were party organs, or the such and such Democrat.
I don't know that I ever knew that.
Yeah, it's true.
So this is early 20th century?
Well, if you go back and look at the names of newspapers, I mean, it's called Arkansas Democrat in Arkansas. And so that was a Democratic publication. And of course, that was Southern Democrat, not like necessarily we would think of Democrat today. But, Mississippi has a paper called the Woodville Republican. Well, it was a Republican Party organ. Yeah. And that's kind of AP, Associated Press, kind of was a service that was seeking to kind of try to satisfy everybody. Like they were going to try and be a news service that was used by everybody, not just one particular party. So each party kind of had their own party line, so to speak, on things. And that was the way it was before the turn of the 20th century. After that was this idea, a more universal idea of what they called objectivity and things like that. The other part of that is today, you see that today.
You see what today?
You see these kind of echo chambers.
Oh, yeah.
In certain TV channels or blogs or whatever. I mean, it's innumerable, the various outlets for, in other words, like if I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat or whatever I am, and I've got a particular point of view, that I'm looking to this particular source that's going to basically be an echo chamber or reinforce that view, as opposed to a source outside that might give me multiple points of view or whatever they are.
Yeah. What sorts of practices would you suggest to person in the suburbs, person living downtown, whoever they are? Mm-hmm. What are best practices in reading or best practices in being informed from your perspective?
Well, the main thing is credible news sources as opposed to Joe Blow's blog.
Yeah.
And to be able to be discerning.
But what do you say to those who just say, well, what goes as credible is fake news, or what goes as credible is biased, or?
Well, I don't know if I can completely answer the question, but I'll just get to the part of it, which is this, in my opinion. Truth matters. And yes, we may not be completely get to truth, but we need to move toward truth. And if truth is no longer important, if you get to have your truth and I get to have my truth and somebody else gets to have their own truth, we don't have truth anymore. That's not truth. Truth is bedrock. Or facts, if you want to think of them in terms of facts, maybe that's a better term to use. There's no such thing as multiple sets. Everyone doesn't get their own facts. There are facts.
Yeah.
And whatever those facts are the facts. Now, people may draw different conclusions from those facts, and they're certainly entitled to do that. But the facts are the facts, and the facts are the facts, and you go from there.
Yeah. What gives you some hopefulness about being a journalist at this time in American culture?
I think it's a great time to be a journalist. I don't know that our profession has ever been more needed than at this time, at this moment in time. And I'm excited about the nonprofit Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. We're trying our best to raise up a new generation of investigative reporters because it's important. How does the public know what's going on? Like with prisons, it's not like the public officials were telling them this.
Right.
We were reporting on this based on developing, a lot of sources, both inside and outside and from within prisons and families and others, this information and be able to show the public what's really happening behind bars. This is important. It's taxpayer money being spent, and how is our tax money being spent? We need to know these things. We need to know the facts, as we're kind of talking about. And when the public doesn't know the facts, when the public's kept in the dark, then we're operating in darkness.
I remember, just as you're talking, I was flashing back to remembering a story. As I recollect, it's been years since I read this story, so I may be missing the facts. But as I recollect, I remember there was a journalist, American journalist, who went to see Gandhi. Mm-hmm. And I remember Gandhi talking about how important the journalist was.
Yeah.
and that in many ways Gandhi couldn't do what Gandhi wanted to accomplish or what he did accomplish apart from the journalist, because the story needed to be told.
Exactly.
And it does seem to be that apart from that sort of rootedness in telling stories vis-a-vis the powers of the world, we don't have much hope in kind of, certainly apart from any sort of violent retaliation.
Right.
In many ways, the journalism is the most nonviolent kind of response to try to break down abuses of power, it seems to me.
It is. And I think you hit on another point there that's important to make, and that is story. How do we tell others story? I mean, I think there's something innately powerful about story and telling a story, because you can teach story to little kids. I mean, you can, and I think, again, to harken back to faith and to scripture, the vast majority of it is story. I find that interesting. I find it interesting that we learn by story, and story is so powerful. And I learned that at some point. I was in grad school. I began to learn how to do narrative nonfiction. I'd not done any of that before. And this is 96, 97.
That would have been really cutting edge, I would think, in the late 90s.
I guess so. But I mean, I read it and loved it. And I'm like, oh man, I want to do this. But I remember I did this piece called Preacher and the Klansmen, which is about John Perkins, who's an African-American preacher and who got involved in the civil rights movement. Tommy Terrence, who was a Klansman in Mississippi, who was involved in a bunch of the violence. And the end of the story is they become friends. And so I remember I got this letter from this guy from Mississippi Delta. He was a 58-year-old doctor. And he said, I never really understood what African Americans had gone through until I read your story. And I'd written about it for years, and it made me realize the power of story. And as I hope that with the book, with Race Against Time, that it becomes that for people, that it's a means by which people can learn. It's not a boring history book. Hopefully it's an interesting story that people can read and take away. And I've heard that back from people as well, that they go, oh man, I never knew all this happened, and that's what you want to do, a story. You want to kind of hopefully share a story people don't know, and they begin to learn from it.
It reminds me too of the power of that story that you just began to tell in your own sort of investigative work, where you get to that point in that courtroom where you realize that the impossible has become possible precisely out of storytelling.
Exactly. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, it really
is. You tell a story, and then that in turn becomes another story.
Right. Yeah.
Or a continuation of the story. It is. It does remind us. And I think sometimes it's real easy to get away from that, to think, it lets you know sometimes if you just assemble a whole list of facts, it's not necessarily going to have the power it will, that if it's embedded within a story.
Well, we've been here talking to Jerry Mitchell, investigative journalist from Jackson, Mississippi. Jerry Mitchell, recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant, and most recently the author of Race Against Time, a reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. Thank you, Jerry, very much for coming to be with us.
Appreciate it, man.
Great to be with you. Thank you. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell, originally recorded back in May of 2020. Jerry's work, bringing to justice those guilty of racial crimes during the civil rights era, is all chronicled in his book, Race Against Time. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carrie Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.